Not all that long ago, I was doing a live stream and someone asked me a question. I can't even remember what the question was, but it directed the conversation towards the topic of homesteading, of living out in the country, even building Catholic community out in the country. And though that was unrelated to the topic of the live stream, that particular topic generated a lot of interest and feedback, both in the comments and as well as people emailing me and asking me, are you serious about doing this? Is there a way that you can put me on some sort of an email list? We've been dying to do something like this. So there's obviously a lot of interest in this topic. There's a lot of people who might consider doing it themselves, but may have some apprehension and want to hear from somebody who has some experience doing that. And that's what this interview is about with Mr. Brandon Sheard. He is somebody who's living the homestead, the farmstead life. He also has a trade as a butcher. So we cover a lot of this kind of content within this conversation. We talk about his conversion to the Catholic Church, what it's like to move away from an urban center and go to live on a farm or on a homestead. A lot of the hangups and a lot of the hesitations that those of us who live in urban centers would have. So he addresses a lot of those kinds of questions. We talk about what it's like to raise animals, to care for them, to kill them, to consume them, that whole life cycle, what it means to humanely care for animals and slaughter them. And how that fits into the natural order and the order of their life and how it is that they were created to be as part of their nature and part of their role within the natural world. So we cover a lot of topics, and it's a really interesting conversation. I was surprised by it. I didn't know Brandon that well. His content had just been introduced to me prior to this conversation. So I was really pleasantly surprised by the range of topics we were able to discuss. And so I hope you will enjoy this conversation too. Just before we get to it, a quick word from the sponsor for today's video. I just want to say a quick thank you to one of the sponsors on my channel, which is the Saint Maker, because this virtue that we are all striving for and this holiness, this is something that by definition, it has to be deliberate. This kind of growth in your moral maturity requires commitments. It requires specific commitments, not just broad ones like, oh, I need to be growing in temperance, but specific nuanced commitments on a daily basis. And if you don't account for grace as an essential ingredient in your moral maturity, then again, you're going to run into problems. And I urge you, as someone who has tried every shortcut and every lazy person's way out, you have to take my word for it. So the Saint Maker, which is this quarterly planner, which is beautifully designed, is like a supercharged spiritual planner and life planner, and it helps you be deliberate about this. It includes goal planning, devotions, spiritual planning. It even includes the liturgical calendar, both the old and the new, so you can plan your spiritual goals around feasts and upcoming important liturgical events. You can grab yours at thesaintmaker.com, and if you use the promo code Brian Holdsworth, they'll give you 10% off. So again, check it out at thesaintmaker.com. Okay, Brandon Sheard, thank you so much for sitting down with me and telling us about your life and your work, and hopefully we can glean some wisdom from you today.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for
Okay,
having me.
yeah, my pleasure. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about you and your work. So, and as a preamble to that, I'll say that my wife is the one who discovered you and your wife in the media that you've been putting out, and she got really excited because this has been a topic of conversation for us recently, but I don't know that much about you yet. I'm just getting familiar. So even for my purposes, if you can fill in some of that background, that'd be awesome.
Sure, yeah. I am, my wife and I, we operate Farmstead Meatsmith, which is how we earn a living. I'm a mobile slaughterman and butcher. I actually go to the farm where the animals are raised and slaughter them there. And then I bring them back and I finish the butchery, the cutting, and the curing in the traditional way here at my shop. So that's what we do for a living. But personally, we're Catholics and we're converts actually from a couple different strains of Protestantism. We're both from California, And we actually just relocated to Oklahoma from Washington State as of October. So we're totally newly moved out here. But we operate our business, and then we have a kind of an online component of that too, where we do a small podcast, and we host an online membership. And largely, if I were to summarize like the whole journey in the past 12 years, we are thirsting for a tradition, and pretty much in all of its forms, we're feeling like these orphans, given the dearth of the failure of the previous generations to pass things down. So I feel like that has been something that we've been seeking. And so both in our faith and then in our work, I find myself unearthing, discovering the traditions of our fathers when it comes to raising animals and harvesting animals and preserving their flesh.
So you use this language of meatsmith, and maybe this is a funny question, but I think of like the glory days of the greatest civilization, which is Christendom, and I say that a little bit tongue in cheek. But in those days, the naming syntax that they had was often based and associated with their trade, right? Their occupation. And so in a particular village, you might find Mr. Smith, who is the blacksmith, and Mr. and Mrs. Potter, who are the potters, and the millers who are the millers, and the bakers who are the bakers. I don't know, what would the butcher have been called? Do you know?
Yeah, I don't know for sure, at least not in English. I mean,
Okay.
Metzger would definitely be German.
Okay.
Metzger is butcher, and
Yep.
you'll see
Okay.
that as a surname.
Okay. So meatsmith, if you called yourself Mr. Smith, I mean, the blacksmith probably would have objected. So is meatsmith actually a technical term, or is that something that's more of a novel invention?
It is a neologism
Okay,
that
it is.
my wife Lauren made up, and yeah, well, it's a great word, and we've actually have had other people, other businesses want to use it.
Okay,
So there's a meatsmith shop in Australia, for example.
gotcha.
But it's a very convenient word because we were trying to encapsulate everything that our business did, which was so much different than the industry today, which is very specialized. So, a meat cutter only cuts meat in a retail setting. But we were doing all these other things. I was doing on-farm slaughter, so I do the kill and the meat cutting and the curing. So, typically that would be the slaughterman or the abattoir, the butcher, the charcutier. I even used to do lots of whole animal roasting for events. So we're doing all these things. We wanted to create a word that would include all of them. So that's where meats came.
Have you guys trademarked it? Or can you trademark it, do
No,
you think? No.
probably. I don't. We haven't been there. That would probably be the mature thing to do, though,
Maybe,
because it
maybe.
is used all over.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, interesting. Tell me about your conversion story. I haven't heard this myself, so I'm interested to hear. It was both you and your wife, it sounds like.
Yes, thanks be to God, we came in together.
Okay.
So yeah, it was. Now I always go by the age of my oldest son because he was 2 when he
Wow.
was baptized in the Catholic Church, and he is now 13.
Okay.
So we both grew up in homes that you would say were practicing the evangelical Protestant faith. Um, and at least in my home, we were in Southern California, and very much in line with a sola scriptura Protestantism. My dad was definitely, well, he went to Protestant seminary, so he's trained as a Protestant theologian, and was frequently, a teacher, and even got offered several pastorates, like was what we used to call it, to be the pastor of a Protestant church. And that was very much I think I would have described myself as a Reformed Protestant, but the words are so mushy that it's tricky. I definitely was a Calvinist, but then I went to college. And I went to a very wonderful, small Protestant school in Santa Clarita, California, called the Masters College. And it was run, and the president of which was kind of our pastor, who some people have heard of. His name is Dr. John MacArthur. And yeah, so definitely vociferously anti-Catholic, you know. And so that was his school, and it's very small. which was great. And it was going there as an English major. So I went into literature, where unlike many of the Bible majors, I read Martin Luther and John Calvin. And that was sort of the beginning of me seeing the deficiencies in my own philosophy as a Protestant, sort of the glaring ones,
Mm-hmm.
that of course it's all by grace that we even see any of these things. But it was reading Calvin, and I was interrogating him because at the same time I was reading these fathers of my faith, we were also reading like Friedrich Nietzsche
Hmm.
and Jacques Derrida and lots of modernists who we called postmodernists, and who made it their joy to unknit and untie the philosophies of the past that they saw as overly simplistic,
Hmm.
all that stuff. They would find the perverse core where there's a contradiction,
Hmm.
a self-referential contradiction in everything, and they would do that with everything except Marxism. They
Hmm.
didn't deconstruct that one, but so I would take these philosophical tools, weapons, really, it's kind of a weaponized philosophy, actually, and I would bring it to bear on my evangelicalism, particularly on John Calvin. And I began to realize that there were just some basic cyclical reasoning involved with my faith. And I remember the moment, actually, I was sitting down in the library. I would read, 6 hours a day, and I was reading the Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin. And he has this phrase towards the beginning where he says, "We hold the testimony of the Spirit superior to the testimony of reason."
Right.
And that was kind of the beginning for me, because I was starting to see before that if I'm going to be an evangelical and hold to these principles, these doctrines. I would not have said the word dogma, but these
Yeah.
doctrines about predestination and about the veracity of Scripture, then I'm going to have to embrace some irrationality. And I'm going to have to insert into my definition of faith this degree of the irrational. Or maybe it's like the super rational, it's beyond.
Okay. Connect that for us a little bit more. Why is that essential to it? I mean, I can appreciate
Yeah.
why reason is held in suspicion within Protestant traditions, but
Mhm.
why is it that if you were to still hold to the knowledge that comes through faith or revelation, that requires irrationality?
Yes, and that was because of our Calvinist theology in particular, I
Okay.
would say. It was the way that it depicted God, and it
Mm.
depicted him as being, or it does, I think, over justice. He is not just, he transcends all of that,
Mm-hmm.
which of course has a kernel of truth. Of course, we're not going to distill, the Holy Trinity into limited concepts that define him perfectly, obviously.
Okay.
But if when you drill down into it, you see that there is an arbitrariness to divine justice
Right.
in the Calvinist system
Yeah.
that defies charity. And that's not what we actually see in Scripture, which is this thing I think a lot of Protestants in that milieu find themselves like. Scripture is speaking of where justice and mercy have kissed, like in the
Right.
Psalms, where these
Mm.
things aren't at loggerheads, and yet in our doctrinal formations, they sure seem like they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was literally reading that passage and beginning to see, I was becoming convinced that if I'm going to hold my faith as a Christian, as an evangelical person, then I'm going to have to embrace and be okay with the idea that there is absurdity. At
Yeah.
least that's how I frame it to myself. Absurdity to divine justice. That if you look real close, it might look a little monstrous even.
Mm.
But because I'm a Christian, I'm not going to think that. I'm instead just going to be okay with it. And maybe that's what the definition of faith is. And so I remember looking at that text of Calvin where he says we hold the testimony of the Spirit to superior to that of reason. So
Mm.
that's just what that means. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
going to put my intellect, which is not a word I would have used then, but on the back burner, and
Right.
I'm just going to move on as if these contradictions don't matter.
Did
And
that
I
did that
even
strike you as
remember,
problematic at the time? Because I think a lot of people would read something like that and not catch the subtlety of it and just think, yeah, okay, the spirit is higher than human reason or something like that. Big deal. That makes sense, right?
yeah, yes, I did. And I think the reason why it seemed problematic to me at that time is because I was seeing the error of sola scriptura. I was an English major, so it's like, man, I understand literature and text and the
Mm-hmm.
way at least that our pastor talks about being this undiluted and unobfuscating channel to the word of God, because all he does is, sermons talking about the Greek and the Hebrew
Mm.
of the Protestant scriptures. That is a serious problem. And so when you take that down to Calvin and you interrogate that, you find that, well, if we hold the testimony of the Spirit superior to that of reason, how do I know that? Well, I thought at the time, I get that from Scripture, a very Lutheran interpretation of Scripture. I get that from the
Mm-hmm.
Bible. It's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
then how do you know that the Bible is true when it tells you that? Well, it's
Right.
because I have the testimony of the Spirit. And they were back at,
Mm-hmm. It's
Proposition
becoming
A.
very circular again. Yeah.
Exactly. So that was what I saw that, and I didn't desire to rebel. I just thought, okay, I think the whole philosophy is contradictory. And so I would have described myself at that time as an existentialist Christian, that
Okay.
absurdity seems to be the way things go.
Yeah.
And I don't want to rebel from that because I see the fruits of my parents' ordered relationship with each other and the fruits of living, a virtuous life in line with the Ten Commandments and God's law. I want
But
that.
virtue not grounded in reason, grounded in revelation. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. In this revelation that sometimes accords with reason and sometimes doesn't.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so I never took a big rebellion from Catholicism, or I'm sorry, from Protestantism
Yeah.
in my heart. It was just that was the beginning of the chink in my own armor,
Hmm.
where I began to, I didn't know it at the time, but what was being formed in my own personal philosophy was a void that was precisely the shape of apostolic succession and the tradition
Mm-hmm.
of the Catholic Church. And it was when I started to see that I started to look into Catholicism.
It's interesting to me because you have conversations with Protestants of various stripes and traditions who don't seem to appreciate how fideistic the origins of their tradition are, right? And sometimes that will be pointed out to them, especially within the origins within the writings of someone like a Calvin or a Luther. And they'll say, well, no, of course, there's philosophy in our tradition. There's theology. There's this science of revelation seeking to understand our faith. But at the same time, they don't really appreciate perhaps a lot of the history that came up and the way that the education system was established and the kinds of things that were formative for people like Martin Luther or John Calvin. So that when they're talking about reason, they're not just talking about the ability to use your brain. They're talking about the Aristotelian tradition that had become the hallmark of our sort of our theology and philosophy by the time they were studying theology. And so they I mean, there are certain things about drawing inspiration from pagan philosophers that I think they already were turned off by, but furthermore, they held our faculty, our human intellectual faculties, to be frail and subject to sin, right? And so something that you can't really trust, you should hold it in suspicion. Whereas faith and revelation, well, of course, that comes from God and that's trustworthy, and we shouldn't hold that in suspicion. And so, why introduce the one compromised component or ingredient to the pure and spotless knowledge that comes through faith? I think a lot of them don't really understand that, but it sounds like in your own conversion, you encountered that. Something else that strikes me about it too is that even if you're a sola scriptura type Christian, you have to confront this fact that the way that St. John describes God is the logos, the word, right? That reason is something that needs to be, like, the fact that we ourselves have a rational soul is what depicts the image of God within us. That's how we connect that to the fact that we were created in God's image. And so to try and divorce or create this distinction between the spirit and its witness and reason as if they aren't fully integrated in a very intimate way, I think is to make an absurdity out of God, or at least the way that he reveals himself to us in Scripture.
Yes, yeah, that's very well put. And that was, you see that played out exactly in the debate between Martin Luther and Erasmus on the freedom
Right.
of the will,
Right.
right?
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's just like Exhibit 1, where
Yeah.
Erasmus is using Aristotelian,
Mm-hmm.
reasoning, very clear, the tradition of the fathers. And Luther's argument is composed of a series of assertions. He is making the brazen attempt at, it's almost like a polemic against reasoning itself. All of Luther's, once you read him, this is why it was so eye-opening to actually read Luther's works.
Yeah.
The success of his arguments rests on the force of his ability to assert. He just asserts them
Mm.
so forcefully. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually very voluntarist. And that's what
Right.
sola scriptura, it gives you this, maybe perverse is too strong a word, but it gives you this perverse ability to assert the
Yes.
words of scripture in the service of your own argument, as long as you can indulge in the illusion that your argument, it doesn't exist. You're not actually
No.
putting an interpretation or a spin or an argument on it. It is just the assertion of scripture itself. So you can assert it
Yeah.
with the force of divine authority
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
man. And you
And
get that every man a pope thing.
the exegesis tends to be very narrow and focused as a result, because you're not taking multiple ingredients and premises and then converting that through reason into something that is coherent. You're just proof texting. You're just saying, oh, look what Scripture says here. Oh, look what Scripture says here. Well, that's what we have to develop all of our doctrines based on. But based on a face value encounter with Scripture, it can often appear to be incoherent or to contradict based on who's writing, what the language is, what the context is. And so you have to inquire much more deeply into Scripture, and have a tradition of at least something like an academic theological tradition to make it coherent and to make sense of it, if not an authoritative tradition on top of that to preserve it and protect it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can see that there is no option to not have a tradition in
Yeah.
interpreting the scripture, right? They just have the anti-tradition tradition
Right.
tends to be,
Yes. To
and
protest against
hence
something.
you have the
Yeah.
warring denominations
Right.
about very grave matter,
Right. Right.
the salvific effect of baptism, in
Mm-hmm.
fact.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think I was uniquely able, just by virtue of being an English literature major rather than a Bible major,
Mm.
to see some of these theological, again, the grace of God. But
Yeah.
you can see that tension. I read a lot of John Milton. He was kind of my
Mm.
favorite guy. He's an arch Protestant, and those tensions in him were manifold. Whereas you could see a similar tension in Shakespeare. However,
Yeah.
he was. Yeah, he dealt with it in a more harmonious way. I think he was more aware of it. And I
Mm.
think that's because he was at least formed Catholic, if not fully Catholic.
Yeah. There's that suspicion out there that
Hmm.
he was a closet Catholic. Okay,
Yeah.
so there was a chink in your armor at this point after having read Calvin. At what point, or what led you to start to warm up to the Catholic faith?
That was my wife. I think
Okay.
that was the begin, like so much grace. That was Lauren, and she was going to Point Loma. She was going to a Nazarene university, and
Okay.
she was studying theology and psychology.
Hmm.
And so my Protestant background would have considered her a liberal,
Okay.
uh, because she was studying these things, and she was occasionally even reading Catholics,
Okay.
which is not something I ever would have done, knowingly at least.
Mm-hmm.
And so honestly, it was through getting to know her and becoming engaged and then marrying her that I just, it's embarrassing to say, but this is where a lot of Protestants are, is you just assume that Catholics are superficial and
Yeah.
what's the word? Superstitious,
Sure.
and they don't understand that you're saved by Jesus and not by your good works.
Right.
And that's where my brain was for a long time on Catholics. And so just reading a little bit of them or hearing them from Lauren, that alone was like, oh, okay, maybe there's something of an intellectual tradition here,
Right.
a
Yeah.
little bit.
There's a sharp
um,
contrast between the Catholic that your Protestant apologists might interview on the streets, and then the actual Catholicism on the books, right? And that's something that we need to address as a church, obviously, I would say. But there's also maybe an inevitable fact associated with that because it's the largest Christian denomination in the world. And if everyone today were, by some miracle of God, to join the true church, like if we could just discard categories and terminology for a second and just say there is a true church, let's say God performed a miracle and everybody had a conversion experience today, the entire world. Well, there's still going to be ignorant people. There's still going to be slothful people, greedy people, wrathful people, proud people, lustful people, etc., etc., etc. So you can't really necessarily blame the church that there is human frailty that will still exist within the world. I mean, the church should help with that and offer salvation, but even within the boundaries of the church, there are a lot of people who are not on their way to sanctification, unfortunately. And so we have to learn to make a distinction between what we mean by the people who are struggling and
yeah.
the pure sort of faith that emerges somehow within that milieu that produces what we get in doctrines and dogma and even theology.
Yes, and I think part of my conversion was definitely seeing that it is possible to live a holy life.
Hmm.
And that because as a Calvinist, you've kind of mentioned it too, that the notion of total depravity, this is why you can't rely on your reason at all.
Right.
Your intellect is only an instrument that you use to indulge your sin. And so you have to flee from reason. It's the devil's whore, like Luther said.
Right. Yeah.
Reason is the devil's whore. And so it was interesting. What I found the deficiency in that thinking for me was, ironically, that just means that I'm going to create my own religious system, my own little faith. And I am just barely suspicious enough of myself to know that I'm going to gratify either my intellectual pride or
Mm.
my desire to control others or any host of sins
Mm-hmm.
because I can design the system myself.
Mm-hmm.
I can design the theology. And so both Lauren and I, we were longing to, and I feel like this might be, we're not alone in this. This is common with our generation, our age. We were longing to receive the truth. It's so
Mm.
mundane, it's so banal and pathetic when I make it up. It's limited by the horizons of my own intellect, and they're like right here. It's so limited.
Mm.
Um, Whereas I began to realize that if you put yourself under subjection, under obedience, so within a restricted, limited sphere, because it comes from God, that is actually the key. That's where freedom is. That's where truth reigns
Mm-hmm.
because of where it comes from, because of who is teaching it. And so like I said, the void of we need tradition to keep this stable and to keep it clear. Um, and so anything that we could receive was something that we were just starving for, as opposed to something that we could conjure with our advanced degrees and our high, ability to read philosophical texts and stuff, because that doesn't cut it, and it provides no solution to my sin,
Mm.
to the problem of my own heart's rebellion against God.
Mm.
That requires grace.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't manufacture that on the earthly plane.
No, certainly. So eventually, you get exposed to some Catholic thoughts, and presumably it just convinces you, or is it a bit of a struggle at that point? And were there particular Catholic thinkers or theologians that really struck you at a certain point where you thought, wow, that's a big solution to some of these dilemmas?
Yeah, it was definitely, John Paul II I did
Lovely.
read a little bit of theology of the body,
Mm.
and well, I crave and appreciate the clarity of some older manuals on those topics. The
Mm.
theology of the body was definitely used by God to. So our move into the Catholic Church was actually simultaneous with our desire to be more agrarian.
Yeah.
We wanted to be more natural in just, the most vague way possible. We didn't
Right.
have this very
Right.
defined, but we
Yeah.
wanted to live, I see now, in accord with the natural order. And so right when we
Mm.
got married, it became apparent that contraception is unnatural. It's some kind of violation of some natural order.
Mm.
And so we didn't do that. And we wanted to, it was searching around a little bit and finding, man, the Catholics are the only ones who talk about this in any
Right.
kind of defined way.
So you arrived at that conclusion on your own, or that was through the influence of JP2?
That was on our own.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, and that was just, and you don't have to look too far, where
No.
we were sort of having a revolution in our own understanding of our body's health and what contraceptives do to the health of women. And
Mm-hmm.
so just that alone was like, wow, if we have to do this much to a woman's body that can be so deleterious,
Yes.
maybe we're swimming upstream, like maybe
Right.
something's wrong
Right.
here.
Yeah.
Um, and so we just wanted to be natural
Mm.
in that way. And it was after that we found the Catholics talk about this. In fact, they're pretty clear about it,
Mm.
thanks be to God. And so that was for us, it's always been coterminous of, coming into the church and living in harmony with the natural order,
Yeah.
uh, as intended by the Creator, by
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of a simultaneous journey for us, reading John Paul II. And then, one of our bold friends who is a Catholic, he took us to a talk by a guy in Washington State who was talking about Mary and addressing with just like sniper precision
Hmm.
all of the hangups that Protestants have about Mary.
Mm-hmm.
And this was years ago, this was
Mm.
12 years ago. It was actually Mark Shea. And he took out each argument so beautifully with so much reason and charity
Mm.
that it was, oh man, really at that point, our arms were kind of laid down. And on the way home, the Catholic friend that took us there, he's like, "You guys want to pray the rosary?" It's like, "Whoa, buddy, I don't know. I haven't ever prayed the Mary before,
Yeah.
but we did,
Hmm.
and so that just opened us up to Our Lady,
What was
and
that
that was
experience like? Was it somewhat mystical for you? Did you feel a sense of grace and peace that came with that, or were you a little uncomfortable?
I was, yeah. So my wife Lauren, she was having extreme back pain from pregnancy,
Hmm.
and so she was pretty much relieved of that after that rosary, and she certainly attributed it
Yeah. Yeah.
to that first rosary that we prayed. I'm kind of weird. I was in the state that I relished the more awkward and uncomfortable the something was, the more it smacked of the truth to me. So
Hmm.
if I delighted in it a little bit,
Yeah.
if I was able to be tantalized by it a little bit and enjoy it, I was
Hmm.
immediately suspicious
Hmm.
of that. Like why?
Sounds very Kantian.
Yeah, and so the more awkward, the more out of left field a little bit, the more it was received, from outside and
Hmm.
not me shaving off the
Not your
hard
own
edges so I like it,
preferences. Yeah.
that exactly. It's like
Hmm.
I always go back to Samwise Gamgee when Frodo asked him about the elves.
Yeah.
So what did you think about the elves, Sam? And he says, well, they're a little beyond my likes and dislikes, if you follow me.
Huh.
you know and
Yeah.
it's like that's what, man, if truth is anything, it's got to
It's
be
got to be that.
beyond my likes and dislikes,
Yes.
please.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's great. The reason I ask about the rosary is because that does tend to be, for a lot of converts, kind of the final domino or the final obstruction to come down, and it's so liberating when it does, because it's like being an orphan and all of a sudden coming home, and your mom is there and she's ready to embrace you, and there's so much good and consolation that comes from it too. I remember I was sort of warming up to the idea of Catholicism. I don't know if you know this, I'm a convert as well, but but Mary was something that seemed, and devotion to the saints was something that seemed strange and maybe superstitious to me. I didn't have a lot of the formation or maybe the prejudices of someone who was really immersed in Protestantism, but I had the sort of the general malaise about those kinds of things of maybe an agnostic or a postmodern. And so I think I was reading St. Louis de Montfort's True Devotion, and I had just finished it. I was sitting, maybe I was setting myself up for this, but I was sitting in a Marian shrine as I was reading it. In the city I live in, it was founded by Catholic missionaries. And so on the top of the hill, they always picked the best spots to establish the church. So they built the church and the rectory and the graveyard, and there's sort of a Lourdes style shrine there. So there's like this big, I don't know, mound of rocks, and sort of built into it is this depiction of the apparition of our Blessed Mother.
Yeah.
And at that point in my emerging, call it a faith, I suppose, I was looking for signs everywhere. I was looking for mystical experiences. I was like, if God's out there, he better give me a sign, and if this is true, give me a sign, and I want signs everywhere I go. And so I don't remember if I had actually asked for one insofar as it relates to Mary, but I probably was thinking, where's the sign? And so I was sitting in this shrine, and I read the last sentence of the book and I close it, and just as I do that, the whole shrine lights up because it's evening, and so all the lights just turn on. And that may seem like an inconsequential or just a coincidence to people listening to it, but in the moment it's sort of like, wow, just the beauty of the moment, and sort of this invitation and this revelation of our Blessed Mother is quite an experience. So it's cool that you guys had, or at least your wife had something, some sort of a healing or something that comes along with that. That's really beautiful.
Yeah, I do kind of wish, that I would have started with something like St. Louis de Montfort, because I didn't really read that until a couple of years ago, or maybe 2 years ago, and that was because it's generally regarded as like the deep end, for a Protestant convert, like maybe don't go all the way to Louis de Montfort, but I think exactly the opposite. Like, you go there. That first chapter is so perfect because it turns on its head so much of what Protestants say about Mary, which is, God could have used anyone. He could have picked anyone. There was nothing special about this particular woman. He could have picked anyone. I don't even like to say that in my mouth, but that cuts both ways, and that's exactly the way that St. Louis de Montfort puts it. He says, yes, out of all the people in existence ever, this woman,
right,
is who he chose.
Yeah.
And it's just such a strange little shift in Protestant thinking, and that's how he starts it. And so I think Protestants should dive right in St. Louis de Montfort.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's been almost 20 years since I read it, so I don't remember it that well. But one of the things that stood out to me about it too was this passionate affection that he has and the way that he talks about her. I remember being really struck by that as a rhetorical device. I found that really effective. I wanted this kind of love that he had for her as well. I wanted that kind of love for anything, but especially for something that is worth fixing that kind of affection towards. And I find that Protestants can be very passionate about their faith. I think fideism can have that effect, right? And so to see that depicted within a Catholic context, I think can be really helpful as well.
Yeah, and you can see that too in our own tradition, where I think I don't know how you can argue with the reality that our most beautiful music, our most beautiful hymns, our chants are written to Our Lady, and they are on every objective measure of beauty, by far the most transcendent and beautiful. And they're written to her, which is only fitting. Yeah.
Okay, so tell me about homesteading and turning to the land, or whatever you understood this to be going more natural. My wife and I, we are born and raised in urban settings, and we have always availed ourselves of the creature comforts that come along with the developed world. But we all are also maybe naively and romantically infatuated with this idea of going to the country. And we've tried to make strides in that direction at times, only to have doors closed on us. And so we feel like we're just on the edge, ready to pull that trigger. Um, it, can you convince us? What is it about it that is worth going all the way in and deep diving in, or should everybody do that?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that is a good question. That is the question because there are lots of reasons why someone might go out and acquire land and start trying to grow as much food as they can and as
Yeah,
they need. And there are good reasons for that. A lot of them are very natural. I mean, there's just the health. Eating better. You can't eat better than the food you can grow. And there are a host of ailments that are solved by just doing that.
mm,
Um, and it has zero risk to your health. That is only beneficial. So we've got on the natural level that, which is a very compelling argument. And then I think too, for us, it was certainly a discovery of the natural order. And not just that, oh, this is how to work with the laws of nature,
mm,
but more specifically, the laws of nature are an expression of the supernatural
yeah,
law, the law of God.
yeah,
And so there is a way in which you are, I think at its best, you can cooperate with the intent, with the will of God by
mm,
working with the natural cycles that He intends.
mm-hmm,
And that is certainly the creating of your own food, which is how our ancestors have always done.
mm-hmm,
And we deprive ourselves of a lot when we outsource that or we pick the convenience over that.
mm-hmm,
And specifically, you know, it has this beautiful, gosh, what is it? It's this combination. You find that there is a built-in modesty. There's a built-in limitation to growing your own food. It is simultaneously the most thrifty option, because you're not dependent upon outside supply, but it is also the most extravagant at the same time. This is literally the most simple meat that you can cure in your home, is fetches the highest price in the global market. Like the best prosciutto produced in the world is from Spain,
mm,
and it's hard to even quantify how expensive it is. $250 a pound
mm-hmm,
for a ham. But the reason it's so good is because it just has three ingredients, which is salt and pork and thyme. And
mm,
it's cured the way that the adept, sagacious housewife in her peasant village would have cured her prosciutto.
mm,
To this day, it is the best. And that's where all of our best foods come from.
mm-hmm,
They are all how our ancestors made them for supplying the home table. That was
mm,
their end,
mm-hmm,
feeding the family.
mm-hmm,
So it's the apex of foodieism. It's incredibly utilitarian. It makes you immune to all power outages, food shortages, and all of the vagaries of centralized modern industrial agriculture, which is extremely fragile. So
mm.
those are all natural reasons, which are all huge rabbit trails that we can go down. Very interesting
Can I
and
ask?
compelling.
Can I ask about a couple of them just really quick?
Yeah, yeah.
Like on the question of affordability, maybe so you would say that raising your own meat is more affordable than buying it in the grocery store.
If you limit yourselves to those things which are necessary.
Okay.
So yes, it can be done, but that's not the goal in the end.
Hmm.
If you, it's really what you're paying for in the grocery store is convenience
Yep.
and the ease of acquiring it.
Hmm.
And in that, you sacrifice most of the value that that animal has to bring to your family table.
Okay.
So,
Do you mean
but
just
that,
nutritionally, or is there more to it about the lessons of life that come along with it?
yeah, definitely the lessons of life. There's nothing like helping you learn the weight of your own existence
Hmm.
than killing an animal that
Okay.
you've raised with your own hand.
Yeah.
So it helps you be less of a silly person.
Yeah.
Because in the urban setting, it takes, I think, extra virtue to realize who and what you are, because you are estranged from the things that sustain you, which
Mm.
would give you a very clear indication of who and what you are, of your limitations and of your frailties. And so just that alone on a natural level, I think helps a lot. But in the end, you know, it might cost more, it might cost less. It choose on depends on the breed of pig, for example, that you might pick, or the quality of the feed that you choose to put in them.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you can do it cheaper and you can do it much more expensively.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, the reason, the telos, why you would do this, um, it has to be it has to be ordered towards charity, and I think
Okay.
that's what makes it endure.
Can you
And
unpack that a bit?
yes, so I think that, and I just steal this from Father Vincent McNabb. He writes on this very eloquently,
Mm.
but he talks about the reason that a people would ever leave the city can be manifold. Everything we
Yeah.
just discussed.
Yeah.
Your neighborhood is going down, and lots of many reasons: health, uh, not being dependent on a fragile system,
Mm.
or cooperating in an evil system, wanting to get out of that. But in the end, the reason people stay on the land is because they go there to worship God.
Mm.
And that's the story of the Exodus, right? And
Right. Right.
that's why they had to take their livestock with them. They couldn't leave them because God was going to show them how to worship him. And
Yeah, that's a detail that
that
a lot of people miss about Exodus is that they weren't going out to just establish a civilization. They were going out in the wilderness to worship specifically.
Yes,
That's why he was liberating them from Egypt. They had to discover who the true God was and how to worship him.
exactly. He was going to teach them directly the liturgy,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
I mean, Pope Benedict XVI talks about that, or I guess he wrote that under Joseph Ratzinger, but
Right.
the spirit of the liturgy. But and I think that in the end is why you go to the land. And the benefits are manifold. Nature builds on grace,
Yep.
right? No,
Grace.
sorry,
Grace builds
grace
on
builds
nature.
on
Yep.
nature. And so
But you start with
there's
nature.
little, exactly, you start with nature. Um, and I think that in the end, that's what makes it stay. That's what keeps you in the land for many generations,
Mm.
which is a crazy project to think about, particularly in the evanescence of modern life.
Yes.
But to actually create something that your children would desire to inherit
Right.
over anything else in the world, and to stay there and live. And it does. You'll see this inscribed in the medieval towns in Europe. They're all over the same way. The center of the town is a hill, and on the top of the hill is the church.
Right.
And then outside of that is the village, the market square right out front, and then the farms outside of that. But everything has a bullseye, and it's literally in the church, on the altar,
Mm.
in the tabernacle,
Mm-hmm.
and that is the center of everything. And so it is seeking the kingdom of God first, and to go out to worship God
Mm-hmm.
rightly,
Mm-hmm.
and in the way that He would direct you.
Mm-hmm.
And then you don't have to worry about what shall we eat, what shall we wear.
Mm-hmm.
That is the refrain of the urban, fragile industrial system.
Hmm.
How are we going to survive in here? Because it does not have self-sufficiency. It doesn't produce its own things, and that's your worry. But all of those will be added if you go to the land to worship God aright. And that's why I think you see these monasteries. They go out and self-sustain, and yes, they do work, but they pray. They are in union
Right.
with God, and that is number one.
Mm-hmm.
And when things are ordered in that way, then your agriculture will endure, and it will work, and it will make sense.
Okay.
But if it's just prepping, if it's just foodieism, you know,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm certainly tempted towards. Like I love cooking. I'm very culinary.
Yeah.
Uh, or, writing out the apocalypse the best you can. In the end, it's got to be worship God to worship God aright.
Okay. It's interesting that you say that this post-industrial system and economy that we rely on, especially as it relates to agriculture, is fragile, because that seems to be, with all the compromises that come with having become industrialized as a civilization, and those were obvious from the get-go, the human rights abuses that came along with the factory system and the technocracy and everything that it just reduced to human beings to cogs in a machine. For
Yeah.
all of those compromises, there does seem to have been some goods that came with it, which is that, if the weather doesn't cooperate, for example, we don't all starve to death the way that we may have 300 years ago or more.
Mhm.
So isn't it? What would you say to the person that says, "Well, no, the industrial system is far less fragile as far as that's concerned. Even through this great pandemic, only the most vulnerable among us are facing those severe kinds of consequences. For the most part, the system is still operating and we're still getting the food that we need."
Mhm.
What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that I would say that well, we haven't been through a long crisis quite yet.
Yeah.
I do think we blew through about a year of reserves in general in the
Okay.
industrial production system. So
Mm-hmm.
I think our reserves are zero. I don't have any real knowledge of that,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
uh, just a basic understanding of the way centralized production works. There's only so much stockpile you can have,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we blew through it. So I think that there's definitely a distinction to be made, and it helps to understand industrialization this way. It sounds weird, but it doesn't actually produce anything that is of primary necessity.
Okay.
What industrialized new beyond what we have always produced or needed to produce for
Mm.
our own consumption,
Mm-hmm.
for our primary needs.
Okay.
It is very good, exceptionally brilliant at producing epic amounts of secondary comforts and secondary needs, things
Okay.
that we don't actually need.
Okay.
And beyond that, it serves to redistribute the goods.
Mm.
And those are kind of the two functions of what an industrialized centralized processing system has offered. Lots of comforts, lots of entertainments, lots of secondary needs or wants, and amazing distribution of those goods all over the place
Mm-hmm.
that are centrally produced.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is inherently there are bottlenecks in every single industry, which is especially in the States, because we only have a tradition of centralized processing. I mean, except for very early on in our
Mm.
country's history. But even with Chicago, we were already, and even Boston, shipping meat all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
And we started that very early because we have masses of dependent cities. And so when you do that, it's actually the bottlenecks are in the processing. So like, for in meat, for example, if one thing in the supply chain breaks down a little bit,
Mm.
the entire economy behind it crashes.
Mm.
And so that's why we had, with that virus that is apparently going around, they had to close so many of the processing plants.
Yeah.
And when you do that, that means that the farrowers, the people that are raising the piglets to
Yeah.
meat, and then the people that are keeping the sows that produce the piglets, they had to incinerate hundreds and thousands of pigs, hundreds and
Wow.
thousands of, because they're slaughtering at a rate of 4,000 a day in one facility, and there's like three in the whole country. And when one thing breaks down, the whole thing does. And it's not just when there's a disaster. That's what was kind of funny about it when the meat plants were in this grave disaster of supply, because of the last 2 years. It's like that's actually par for the course. In
Hmm.
fact, you par for the course is to raise hogs in a pig barn, and they have to be within 1% of the finished harvest weight. And
Okay.
if they're over or under, they're incinerated
Wow.
or they're buried.
Yeah.
They're killed and buried. And that's because we have to process 4,000 pigs a day. You need to have a system
Right.
that admits for no unique pigs. They all have to be the exact same dimensions
Right.
to be able to do that quantity. And so at the
So
very
it's
least,
extremely wasteful and just indifferent
yes,
towards, well, certainly the natural order and the
yeah,
wow. Okay, so on the question of homesteading, then, if you're somebody, so what you do relates very much to the lifestyle, obviously. For someone like myself, who is very much invested in technology in the online world and communication, or say somebody in a more traditional field like, let's say, accounting or something like that, um, would you give would you encourage someone like that to go and get some land as well, or is it unsustainable to hold down a full-time job and then also have a garden and have some animals and a bit of a hobby farm?
yeah. I think that it is so possible and
Mm,
so enriching to take on as much as you can.
okay.
And it's, I don't always like to paint it as this is the good prepper option because everything is going to go down, which a lot of people do it for that reason. But what you find is that it accords with your nature. It's how we are wired.
Mm,
And domestication is this great, it's part of fulfilling the intent again of the Creator and giving dominion
mm,
to Adam and Eve.
mm-hmm.
And so you find that you know how to do this. This is actually something that's
Part of your
in
nature.
us. It's
Yeah.
part of your nature and it's in the animals.
Mm,
It's a very evolutionary notion to regard to take any example, the family milk cow as a diminished wild bovine, on the plains in Europe.
yeah.
But it's actually not. It's a fulfilled one. The dog is a fulfilled wolf
Interesting. Yeah.
because we have we believe in a creator
Yeah.
who has arranged nature in such a way that the animals are under our dominion. And so when we make them cooperators
Mm,
in our own sustenance, it's
mm-hmm.
actually a really good deal for them as a species, but as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
But
Hmm.
it also it's an elevation, of their role on the earth to actually serve us and be part of our, it's not a mystical body, but it's a structured body that is our
Yeah.
family life,
Yeah. Something
Um,
as of the participation in the rational life of
yes.
human.
And you can see this remarkably, like in, border collies that are born
Hmm.
knowing come by, you know,
Hmm.
they are born knowing commands, which is
Yeah.
remarkable.
Yeah.
That is not a pathetic wolf. That is a fulfilled one.
Right.
Um,
Wow.
So, but there's so much more. So it's you can find guides. This has been a plight of many people since industrialization, really, and even before. When people are plagued with not having a lot of land
Mm-hmm.
and having to work full-time jobs, and but it still makes sense for them to produce as much as they can. You can read a guide written in 1833 by one of my favorite authors, William Cobbett, and Chesterton wrote a biography on him.
William
William Cobbett.
Cobbett, did you say?
Yes.
Okay.
Cobbett.
Okay. Yeah.
William Cobbett. He's got a book called The Cottage Economy.
Hmm.
And in it, he's writing to cottagers who do not, they have like 40 rods of ground, which is very little. They do not own lots of land and they're working a lot in factories. Nonetheless, he writes a guide for them. And this was
Hmm.
very common, particularly in England at the time, to produce their own bacon. And bacon is synonymous with pork. He means
Yeah.
all the things that a pig yields, which is primarily bacon in the English language. To raise their own bacon, so their own pig, their own milk, their own beer, and their own bread, all on their little patch of ground. And it's intensely practical and it's extremely doable. Part of the battle that we have in the modern era is that our domesticated livestock have been perverted by the industrial system. So we breed them over the generations to be suited to the feedlot or the industrial pig barn, not the backyard,
Mm.
which is actually where they all come from. So the pig is a backyard animal, for example. It doesn't need vast rangelands.
Yeah.
That's Pigs haven't been raised that way for since the forests,
Mm.
in Europe. They've been domesticated that long, and then they brought some here, and they proliferated like mad in the forest.
Mm.
But once the forests are gone, then it's the pigs are the backyard animal, and they
Mm-hmm.
actually can thrive there.
Mm-hmm.
But you got to find old genetics. You got to find old, more domesticated, less industrialized pig genetic, which is not hard to do.
Mm.
So it's all very doable. It's remarkably doable. It is the prowess of the home kitchen, the production of ham, bacon, beer, bread, cheese, dairy. That is all the native prowess of the domestic kitchen, not chefs in lab coats.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you say to the person who loves what they're hearing? They're thinking, yeah, this appeals to my heart, and I would love to be out in the country worshiping God, being at one with my own nature and the natural law, but um, I'm a social person and I have all of these commitments. I've got my kids go to school in the city, my church is in the city, I have activities in the city, and getting an acreage or any plot of land really close to the city is too financially restrictive. Um, is it socially prohibitive to be doing what you're doing for most people? Would you say, or is it the opposite? Like, tell us about your experience.
Yeah, no, that is a great question because that is one of the greatest challenges, just the way you put it.
Hmm.
It's trying to get land and be close to the liturgy, and
Hmm.
because the liturgy tends to be in the cities.
Yeah.
And so that's a real challenge, and that was why we moved. We were in Washington State,
Okay.
where we were on an island. It was beautiful. We attend the fraternity of St. Peter there, St. Joseph's, and it was, I always say it was like a second conversion for us to discover the traditional liturgy of the church and
Yeah.
specifically the traditional moral theology.
Hmm.
Um, it was only after almost 10 years of being Catholic that we
Yeah.
discovered it and we realized, oh, that's what we thought we converted to in the first place, and then we found that it
This
still
sounds
exists.
familiar. To
Yes,
my own
yes. So
experience.
that was all that to say. We were going 2 hours on a ferry boat. It was a 2 hour both way to go to
To go
church,
to mass. Wow.
and yeah, to go to mass, and we wanted to go to daily mass. We wanted to go, and so we did. We would go several times in the middle of the week, and lots of homeschooling, lots of meals happen
Hmm.
on the ferry boat. Waiting for the ferry boat to get to mass, and
Hmm.
so that was our primary impetus for getting out within reach of a parish, of a traditional parish, where we could be, sub 15-minute commute.
Okay.
And that, just like you say, that narrowed our choices down to like 5 places in the whole country.
And
Um,
you said you're in
because
Oklahoma
again,
now?
now we're in Oklahoma. Yeah,
Okay.
we needed the land
Yeah.
so we could grow. And we have 10 acres now, which is we had 2.5 there. We expanded a lot,
Hmm.
and we're 15 minutes from our parish, which is wonderful. We are just like you say, we're paying a little bit of a premium to be 30 minutes outside of the city.
Hmm.
And you just get closer to the city, the prices go up.
Yeah.
But it was worth it to us to be within that commute to make daily mass possible.
Hmm.
Because I know, I need that to be convenient. I feel like particularly the traditional mass, it is the mass of the week. It's beautiful and prayerful. You don't have to have a high degree of virtue to be able to shut out any banality or distractions that you might at
Hmm.
another mass.
Yes.
Um, and so just having that proximity was a big priority for us. And but yeah, there's Idaho, Wisconsin, Oklahoma. There are places where you can get some land close to a good parish.
Mm.
It was very much as simple as searching for the map of the ICKSP and the fraternity parishes in the
Mm.
country, together with the app for, all the homes for sale.
Yeah.
Those two windows on our computer for about a year and a half.
Isn't it a bit of a terrifying thing, though? I mean, if you are anchored within a geography in which you have family and friends and job and all of these things that we try to build up in our lives to pick up and to move to another state, um, is it worth it? How realistic is that? I mean, what did you guys compromise, and do you have regrets to that at all?
We don't have any regrets. It was, I think we were a little fortunate in that way. My family kind of left the area where we were living,
Hmm.
so I didn't have to leave them. Um, but we did have to leave Lauren's family, and but it's none of our family is Catholic too, and so we have a different trajectory. Particularly, we have 8 children. The
Hmm.
more the more children we have, the more precious their innocence becomes, and
Hmm.
innocence in the technical way, like the kind of innocence that Adam had before the fall, such
Yes.
that his appetites were in such line, perfect
Right.
to his intellect and his will, that he could probably even control his involuntary bodily functions.
Right. Yeah.
And consequently, all of nature was subject to him as
Yes.
well.
Yes.
And that kind of innocence is actually that ordering of the self in the life of virtue under the intellect. That's actually how you have the habit to resist the attacks
Hmm.
of the world of flesh and the devil, because you do
Hmm.
not have a taste for them. So
Hmm.
it became very important for us to raise our children and maintain their baptismal innocence as best
Hmm.
we can.
Hmm.
And so honestly, separating and going out, is it's historically a very Christian to do. A lot of Catholics
Hmm.
have done it over the years,
Hmm.
and a lot of family doing it now. Um, Again, and I think if it's going to be of any kind of long life, it has to be prioritized around the worship of God.
There's going to be a lot of people hearing that who are going to say, "Oh, this sounds like the Benedict option. This sounds like retreating away from the world when we're supposed to be missionaries within the world."
Hmm.
What do you say to that? I mean, first of all, I would say that that's a misunderstanding of what the Benedict. I don't know if you're familiar with the book or not, but
I
that
haven't
would
read
be
it, just familiar.
no.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So that's not actually what he's advocating for. He's advocating for. He's saying that the world around us has become so decadent and so uh, I mean, corrupt might be a little bit strong, but the trappings of the world are so pressing and so prevalent and pervasive that to try to raise families that retain that kind of innocence is next to impossible. Let alone growing in virtue yourself for those of you who are already grown up. And so we need to start. We need to retreat in a way to our own communities where we can promote the truth of the natural law, the truth of faith, and where we can worship in a way that is worthy and just of God's glory, um, and then strengthen ourselves in culture, in actual culture, because you don't get culture in the world of multiculturalism
Hmm.
and cultural relativism. It's nearly impossible without putting up some sort of walls around your own domestic culture or community culture, because the other culture is so suffocating and loud that it will drown out whatever kind of culture you cultivate yourself. And so we need to retreat and strengthen some sort of community dimension of community and culture so that we can be sources of missionary love and zeal and charity and service to the world. But a lot of people look at that and just say, well, no. I mean, I even know of people who refuse to homeschool because they have this idea in their minds that, our kids are missionaries within the school system. I'm just thinking, no, they are sheep among wolves. Like
Yes.
they're not ready for that. For one, you're just sacrificing them on the altar of the modern economy and creature comforts and things like that. So Um, I I want to return back to. There's got to be a question in this little rant, but um, would you say that that's something like okay, so what would you say to people who object to this notion of the Benedict option, or that we shouldn't be retreating away, we should be sending ourselves out?
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that sometimes you just have to leave the flesh pots of Egypt. I mean, it's not
Mm,
that's this isn't out of the ordinary for the people of God. This is
mm-hmm.
actually our pattern. And when you do that, there's obviously evangelism in the long game, which is evangelism by procreation. And if you create children that are live in a state of grace and love God,
Mm,
they're going to redeem, the world. They're going to make saints. I mean, that's really how you save the
right.
city.
Yes.
And I think that that's what will happen. And especially if they're innocent and inept and ignorant of all the urbane grotesqueries of the city.
Mm,
And that's but rather in love with God. And that's
mm-hmm.
that's how they that's how the city is saved. And people will be attracted to that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's goal number one, is just living within that natural order of procreating and then educating your children in the faith so that they can be saints, and
Mm-hmm.
and helping, working on yourself in the same way. And because there, I think another distraction in this is the Catholic community. And it's this thing that I understand the longing for, because we do not have communities in the modern era at all.
No.
We're so
Right.
isolated from each other. We're competitive and vicious, and it's horrible. Um, and so I understand why we long for an idea, of community. Um, but in the end, it's impossible unless the Lord builds the house. Those who labor will build in vain. We can't do it without grace. And so
Mm,
the primacy of being in a state of grace, I just think is, I mean, it's so simple. It sounds too simple to say this, and it is, but it's like, if that,
but unattainable at the same time in the way that the world is arranged for us these days. It is
well,
simple, but somehow not many people seem to enjoy it.
yes, and I was among them before I discovered the tradition of the church, and even using, the word tradition, it sounds like such a label, but I mean, like, technically, the depository of God's love and truth to us,
Yeah.
that is in the tradition, literally from Christ down through the centuries to us,
Yeah.
preserved in
Yeah.
tradition. And
Yeah.
if we think we're more creative than that, then we have stepped outside of the realm of grace. And
Yes.
without that, we can do nothing. It's over. And that's why I think it's
Mm-hmm.
no exaggeration to say we must return to God's truth, to the tradition, and to priests that are formed in it. Otherwise, we're
Mm-hmm.
stuck with modern psychobabble, which
Mm-hmm.
where there is no grace. And
No.
there might be sacramental grace, but it is immensely hindered by our inability to be disposed to receive it and cooperate with it. And so
Mm-hmm.
that was just my experience. I think that the solution is go to mass and get in a state of grace. And I say go to a traditional mass, because
Mm-hmm.
that is the most untrammeled and undiluted uh, preservation of God's truth and God's teaching to us, which is
Mm-hmm.
where the grace is, of course, right? I mean, it can't be outside of that. It comes from God. It's not our own work,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really where I think that the battle begins and ends. Is because it's
Mm-hmm.
possible to be a practicing Catholic going to mass, and if your priest is not formed, and I know this
Yeah.
from personal experience, you can go to mass and you can be in a state of mortal sin for years and not know it,
Oh no.
because your priest doesn't even know, and or is incapable or unwilling to guide you properly. in the confessional. And if you do not have that truth, then you do not have grace. I mean, you are crippled. You are dead. You are dead in your trespasses and sins. So
Yeah.
there's no way you can create community. There's no way you can have an agrarian Catholic paradise. It's not going to happen, because the first thing isn't first. And so I never want to underestimate the essential nature of God's moral theology as he gave it to his church and developed it through its saints. I mean, priests today, they're not even formed through St. Alphonsus Liguori, and you read St. Alphonsus and you're just, how could we deprive anyone of this? This is unthinkable, the clarity and the grace that is there.
Yeah.
So that's what I keep coming
Depriving
back to.
depriving is a good way of describing it, because I tend to think of tradition as being there's a generosity to tradition, which is that we haven't inherited something that we didn't have to build ourselves and that we can build upon and make even better. Like, that's true progress, right? Actually moving the dial forward towards some sort of good that we've identified, right? But progress is saying, I'm going to inherit all the good that comes forward, but I'm not going to pass it on. And you even see this in something as superficial as, say, like art, right? Like, so art, the shift in art and our sensibilities about art in the 20th century. So you look at like the pop music revolution that took place in sort of industrialized music, whereas like groups like the Beatles, for example, or even the more virtuoso kind of musicians of that era, like an Eric Clapton or a Jimi Hendrix or something like that. These were people who had inherited a musical tradition that was quite sophisticated, but they didn't then perform it. They performed something that was more base, really, more primitive, and they were quite good at performing that. But then the next generation only inherited that and were blocked from the greatness that came before them. And so you see this regression in cultural sensibilities as each generation inherits something that is less sophisticated, less beautiful, less impressive than the generation that came before that had inherited something that was more impressive. And even pop stars like Eric Clapton have gone on the record to say, like, music today sucks. What's wrong with these people? And it's like, well, you're the architect of that.
Yeah.
You refuse to pass along what you had inherited. There's a greed in that,
Yes.
I think. Whereas tradition is this generous, I inherit a thing, I'm not going to keep it for myself, I'm going to pass it on to my children. And that takes work and effort to actually do. It's there's a laziness in progress as well. It's just figure it out for yourself, reinvent the wheel yourself. It's like, well, it would save me a lot of trouble if I didn't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
If you could just show me how that works.
Right. Yeah.
You know?
Iconoclasm it's so much easier to smash a painting than to paint one.
Than to create one.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah, there's something so demonic in that.
yes. Yeah. It's just iconoclastic, and it's the revolutionary spirit. And I feel like that's the primary contribution of a Martin Luther. And I think who's articulated this so well is oh, come on. He's meaning of Catholic, you know him.
Kelly?
Timothy
Is that his name?
Flanders.
Flanders.
Timothy
Okay.
Flanders. He's articulated this so well, talking about, Martin Luther. Historically, you just look at his work and you read him too. You see this. It's not that he is reforming the church. I mean, obviously, it was a pure revolution, but revolution particularly as not just, here's another option. Here is a tradition that has
Here's another
elders,
good.
yeah, and it has its own
Yep.
elders, its own doctrine, its own liturgy, and we're just going to go this way now. It was no, he was the anti-tradition tradition. It was no tradition. It was perpetual revolution, and so such that
Yep.
today we think that something is genuine or authentic if it is the fruit of impetuous enthusiasm. The more brazen, the more forward and emotive, so anchored in the appetites that it is, the more legitimacy we confer upon it, because our judgment is so skewed by that.
Right.
And I just think the traditional liturgy is such a remedy to that, because it is such an intellective beauty. It's a beauty that appeals to your intellect. It's not just like you said, the primitive, thriving, counterbeat of modern music that appeals to your appetites.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. Okay, I want to shift over to a conversation about meat,
Yeah.
raising meat, and butchering and and preparing and all of these things, because this is obviously what you do. This is something I've thought about, in my own ignorance, because I'm not exposed to that whole culture and trade in my own experience as someone who's always been in an urban setting. But there seems to be something extremely profound in the experience of what I imagine it is like to raise an animal, to butcher it, and to eat it. I get this sense from people who are animal rights activists or vegetarians for ethical reasons that they think that you're just cruel, that you like to kill animals, right? And well, let me ask you. Maybe it's too rhetorical to ask you this question, but do you like to kill animals? Is that why you do what you do? You love blood and violence and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's well, let's see. I would say actually, if I were more virtuous and my intellect had more mastery, over my appetites
Hmm.
and then yes, you would like to kill animals because
Okay.
it is more ordered. The thing that happens to animals if you don't kill them is a torment that you would not wish on any being on planet Earth.
That's Yes, that is a really good point. There are no animals out in the forest who are dying with their loved ones around them in a nice cushy in their sleep. They're getting eaten alive, every
Yes.
single one of them.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't happen in the wild. I'm sorry. To be killed quickly and in a precise, sophisticated way is the least amount of suffering that an animal could hope for in their death.
Absolutely. And you just don't know it until you encounter it. As a mobile slaughterman, I've been called on to be a knacker every once in a while, which is basically
Okay.
you come take care of an animal that's either already died of some
Yeah.
disease or age or problem, or is on death's door and they're not fit for
Mm.
food. And that's
Okay.
what knackered did. Traditionally, that's where we get the term, I'm knackered, and for being
Okay.
exhausted. And
Yeah.
so it's remarkable. You get, like I've done this for ewes that were just lawn ornaments. They were lawn. So an older sheep, she's like 13 years old, and she is
Mm.
just there to clip the grass. She's never
Mm.
lambed, and so she goes down one day, at 13 or 14 years old, and if she's on the ground, she's still technically alive, but half of her is rotting. And it's not even from
Mm.
predators, it's just internally, she is decomposing.
Right. Right.
Bacterial infection, her liver is just disintegrating.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she already smells of death, and she's not even dead yet. And
Mm.
so to take that animal's life, you really get to see, oh, all of that business about not killing animals because to prevent suffering is hogwash, and it's
Mm.
it's very much a self it's yeah, it's the prototypical self-flattery of the urbanite, where I think
Mm.
you are permitted, it's easier for you. It's not essential. If you have virtue, you don't think this way, but it's easier for you to
Mm.
perceive yourself as a disembodied mind that
Right.
bears no weight on the earth or any natural order at all. There's no cost to your being.
Hmm.
And that's just
And that
a
that's the ideal way to be materially inconsequential and to be
it,
just, yeah, this roaming intellect. Yeah.
yeah, materially inconsequential. That is a great way to put it. That's like the ideal, and that's why they get very puritanical.
Right.
In their
Right.
zeal, they have to maintain this illusion of inconsequentialism, purity,
Mm.
unsoiled from any cost to any other being.
Hmm.
Whereas in reality, when they mow down the fields of soy to make the tofu meat imitation products they're eating, they are destroying not just the habitat, but literally hundreds of thousands of rabbits and mice in the combine with every
Right.
head.
Right.
It's it
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
the mountain of carcasses is piled high on vegetarian food
Right.
products.
Yeah.
And it's again just because of industrialized agriculture. So I find that if I like to slaughter the animals, it's because I relish the end for which they are ordered, which is to
Yeah.
feed my children and to feed my family. And for me to have as a means to offer at a wonderful feast in a liturgical year and to be hospitable. So when it's ordered
Mm.
towards food, you look at an animal and think that's going to be delicious bacon. And that is not a savage, but an ordered way to look at the
Mm,
pig because its nature is fulfilled in the excellent bacon. And it actually puts the responsibility on you to create a wonderful product. I mean, what
sure.
it's just an added travesty to take that animal's life and then to create an insipid meal
Yeah,
from it.
that's an interesting point. Yeah, no kidding.
Doesn't that doesn't work.
Um, what would what do you think about animal rights? And I wanna refine the question a little bit more in the sense that this there's there seems to be this inclination to want to put animals on a field of significance that is similar to
Mm.
human dignity, right? And I want to introduce some Thomism to this question as well, because I think so. And Aristotle as well. Aristotle has these sort of degrees of the soul, or types of souls, right? So there's the
Hmm.
vegetative soul, like, which would be plants and things like that. There's the sensitive soul, which would be the brute animals, I think, as Thomas describes them. And then there's the rational soul, which is us and I suppose angelic beings and that kind of thing. Um, but the rational soul is a subsistent soul. It's a soul that persists beyond matter
Yes.
if it becomes disembodied from the material world, right? Whereas the sensitive soul, everything about that soul can be traced to a sensitive function, right? Like it, there's nothing up that a livestock animal does that doesn't have a material origin to it, right? So there's nothing to indicate that they have an eternal soul,
Right.
that their soul will continue after the the material end that they would face at death, whereas we do. And so there's the significance of what happens to a rational soul um, is much more consequential,
Hmm.
right? And just almost out of justice alone, you could say that the world should be so arranged to address that consequence more than perhaps the merely sensitive souls, right? Because we live on, and so the consequence of what that eternal reality looks like is quite a bit more important than whether or not a pig who lives for 10 years gets to enjoy himself or not.
Yes.
So, I mean, do you agree with that? Am I off base in your own experience of having raised animals?
No, I think that that makes perfect sense. And I think you can even go further and say that it is only a modern, well, maybe it's a perennial error. I don't know. I tend to
Mm,
associate it with the modern era, but that
okay.
subordination is a diminution of dignity. That to
Okay.
actually be in your place in the order, in the created order, is a diminution of your dignity, is a slight, is
Mm,
you being oppressed, or the pig
okay.
being oppressed because it serves the
To be
purpose
something that he's
of
not.
feeding the family. And I
Mm,
think that's just a straight up error, and my experience resonates with that. A
mm,
fulfilled pig is one that is slaughtered artfully in its prime, having never to struggle for any food or have to worry about any predators its whole life.
yeah.
And it lives in harmony and in benevolent confinement and in comfort. And then one day it's eating a meal, and then the next moment it is dead
Yeah.
without pain, without excessive and undue pain. And it's artfully harvested. That's a fulfillment of that pig. Its subordination is actually the exaltation of its nature to where God has designed it to be in subjection to
Yeah.
us.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds, by what you're describing, that you're quite deliberate about a humane process of slaughtering them, like that you don't drag them out by their feet while they're squealing and parade them through, a house of horrors before they're eventually killed.
Right. Yes, and it's actually there's many reasons to not do that. One is it's recklessly inefficient. I mean, you'll
Mm,
find, just the first time you go to kill an animal for your food, just purely the most efficient way that will cause the less damage to yourself and your surroundings is an instantaneous and precise kill. And
okay.
but yeah, you have affection for that animal, and it's an ordered affection. It's like you are dependent upon me. I'm going to kill you and harvest your flesh to sustain
Mm,
myself. And
mm,
that it's not contrary to that to have affection for that creature in an ordered
mm.
way. I'm fond of my
Right. Right.
pigs,
Yeah.
and the things that I like about them makes them easy to kill well. And that's not a
Yeah.
contradiction in terms. That is the fulfillment of their nature. In fact, it's hard because I host a lot of classes. You know, I have lots of people come out and they see an animal be killed for the first time in many cases, and there is the impulse to want to separate an animal from its group before you kill it,
Okay.
thinking that we don't want the other ones to see it.
Right.
We don't want them to see the death or the blood. But once you start introducing these things, you find that the best way to ensure a very miserable kill and a unnecessarily drawn out torturous event is to pick an overly compassionate person to do the slaughter,
Mm.
because they will anthropomorphize. They will
Yes.
underestimate the
Yes.
nature of the animal and how God designed it, and even how we cooperate with God in designing it through genetic
Through raising it.
selection.
Yep. Yep.
You will underestimate that, and you will overestimate the animal's intellect, which they don't have, right? Just like you're
Right.
saying, they're on that, they have that sentient soul. So you will treat it like a human, and you will find that if you separate a sheep or a pig from its group, you will cause undue suffering to all of them because they do not fear death. They do not fear your knife or your gun, or the kill of one of their number. They do not fear that. They
Hmm.
they are programmed rather to avoid separation. They fear
Hmm.
separation. That is not in their nature. They hate that. So if you try to
Hmm.
separate a pig from its group to kill it out of sight, all
Mm-hmm.
the other pigs will start vocalizing and objecting, not just the
Mm-hmm.
pig you're forcing away. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
in general, the rule is to, and it only makes sense on the homestead because you don't have excessive animal management apparatus on the homestead, is to not be coercive, excessively coercive in your slaughtering. You actually have to
Mm.
be docile to the nature of the animal, perceive the way that it works. A sheep, is an herbivore that pretty much considers every other animal a predator. And so there's a particular way that you handle that kill that's distinct from a pig. And
Mm.
the result is that you end up having to kill the animal in the most intimate way, so you can, meaning close proximity, you're right up on the animal, so that you can ensure that it is artful and quick and decisive, um,
Mm.
and in a way that accords with its nature. And
Hmm.
so it is an art, but it doesn't take much. You just have to observe them because you can trust the data of your senses, which is another Thomistic principle, Aristotelian, I guess,
Mm.
that you can actually perceive the nature of the pig by watching the habits of the pig. You can understand its material soul and
Mm.
how it works
Mm-hmm.
and the
Mm-hmm.
best way to take its life.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you would think that someone who has such intimate access to animals and raising them and being around them, such as yourself, would have a more fluent understanding of what its nature is. And if you believe in something like a soul conceptually, then you would be probably the most appropriate person to consult about what is the nature of its soul, right? But I think that for those of us who are removed from that context, who don't spend time with animals, who've probably never been in close proximity to a pig, for example, it's very easy to anthropomorphize them then because we think, oh, well, they're sensitive, we're all part of the genus of material beings, and therefore they're just a slight degree away from all the emotional trauma and psychological challenges that come along with being put in a pen and being killed in front of your friends and all of this kind of thing. And that in fact, you just must be indifferent to that because you're the one doing the actual killing. So you're the last person we should consult about this. But
Yeah.
it's fairly plain talking to someone like you that you do have great affection for them and you really care about doing the right thing here. This isn't just about taking advantage of the world and harvesting everything out of it that you can. It's about working in accord
Yeah,
with it, like you've said.
absolutely. And you see that with every species in a unique way. And in the case with sheep, for example, like they have one option when it comes to responding to the presence of a predator, and that is flight. And if you can prevent them from fleeing, either
Hmm.
by corralling them very closely and in the way you handle them, then you are not so much taking their life as
Hmm.
they are surrendering it. And it's totally unintelligible until you see it. But
Yeah.
you have to understand their nature. There's a herding animal that flees predators. That's what they do. And so
Mm-hmm.
because they are so embodied, just like you were saying, with their material soul, that their essence, which ends when their body does,
Mm-hmm.
they are because of that, they have the nature to stay close together. And if you
Mm-hmm.
can prevent them from running, you prevent panic and anxiety. If you
Mm-hmm.
control their body, you control their sentience,
Yeah.
control
Yeah.
their mind. And
Yeah.
so the way you slaughter a sheep is you you can't chase it. You have to corral it very closely so it cannot run. It doesn't have room to take lots of long leaps. And then
Yeah.
you grab it very decisively. And the first time you do it, you feel violent, but it is no favor to the sheep to be timid at all. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, it will cause greater suffering. So you have to be decisive and quick, and you hold the sheep a particular way, and you angle its head up, and then you lay the sheep down on its side so its legs are out like this, and you pull its head back so its neck is exposed to the sky, and you don't use a gun, you just slice their throat.
Mm-hmm.
And it is possible to do this so well that there is no struggle at all. So actually, if you are artful about this and responding and killing the animal in accord with its nature, you're not forcing its death upon it in the sense
Mm-hmm.
of, I gotta hold you down and then deal the death blow.
Mm-hmm.
Such that if you get good at it, you can lay a sheep down and you can kind of pull its head back so it's laying down. And then you can stand up and walk away and it will stay down
Mm-hmm.
because it hasn't
Mm-hmm.
fled. It doesn't feel chased or hunted.
Yeah.
And then with one swift stroke of a very sharp knife, and it can't be anything less than scary sharp, you
Yeah.
open the carotid and jugular arteries, and the lamb bleeds out in about 30 seconds.
Mm.
And we do kid ourselves if we want, again, we like to flatter ourselves about our harmlessness. If we think that death doesn't hurt, it always hurts, even when it's done perfectly. It hurts.
Yeah.
And but we can get to the point where you can almost lay a lamb down silent before the slaughterers, and they will stay down and you can take their life in calmness, such that it's not so much you taking or extracting their life as you are elevating them to the point where they're almost giving it. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is the highest any sentient being can aspire to, is this
Mm.
act of self-gift. Because in fact, that's what ends up happening. We consume their flesh. And
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
is, and we say, "Bless us, O Lord, for these thy gifts."
Right.
And because in the end, even after the whole narrative of all the work you put in raising and harvesting, butchering and curing, cooking that sheep, that lamb, when you do it at home and you endeavor to receive the entire animal as food, you cannot help but recognize it as a gift because
Yeah.
it's more, so much more abundant than you anticipated. That's the thing people are most surprised by. When you harvest your own meat, you have way more food that you know what to deal with. It's the burden of abundance.
Whereas both the person who buys meat from the grocery store and the person who refuses to eat meat refuse or are less likely to recognize the gift of it, it
Yes.
seems.
Yeah, the sentient origins of the animal are concealed through the commodification of meat. In fact, it sells better when you don't have that.
Yes. Yeah.
When it's not clear that this came from an animal. And they used not to be that way. Butcher shops would actually display the offal, so the liver, the lungs on a lamb carcass, because the savvy housewife, who wasn't yet totally estranged from the farm, she could
Mm.
tell, that's a fresh liver. It hasn't
Mm.
been oxidized for 5 days. That lamb was recently killed, and she could tell that's a
Interesting.
good one. She'd pick
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I wanted to set up a question about Catholics who are vegetarian or vegan, and I wanted to ask you about like theological grounds. If you can think of any theological reasons why that is a bit of an incoherent a sense of identity or moral behavior, but I don't want to. I'm going to refrain from offering my own commentary on it. I want to see just what you think of that and where you go with it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't thought about it much other than the monks. A lot of them will live in a vegetarian way,
Okay.
but they just won't eat meat because, like
Hmm.
Saint Benedict says, they're pretty much always in Lent. In his rule, it's a perpetual Lent. But it
Mm-hmm.
is penance. which
Right.
is an
Right.
assertion of the
It's not
good.
because of animal rights
That's right. It's an assertion
or
of
what
the
we think
good
of
of eating
animal
meat.
rights.
That's why.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
because it's a good, it's
Yeah.
delightful, and it's
Yeah.
nourishing. So
Yeah.
far from being any indictment of meat, it's actually an argument for the
Yeah.
goodness of consuming meat. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a penance.
Yeah.
And then I think that other than that, yeah, there's no history apart from the monasteries that I know of Catholics being vegetarian or vegan apart for seasons of penance. And
Mm.
the same rule applies there. You know, the fact that we don't eat meat during Lent is not indication, or historically, that meat is bad and that it's somehow more holy to go without. It's that meat is
Right.
good and it's hard to
Right.
go without. So it's
Right.
a
Yep.
self-imposed suffering. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, but what are your
That
thoughts about that?
Well, that's certainly something that occurred to me is this notion that depending on your jurisdiction, you're supposed to fast from meat on Fridays as a penance, recognizing the good of the thing that you are sacrificing.
Yeah.
Um, Certainly, our blessed Lord ate meat. That's indicated throughout Scripture.
There you go.
He celebrated the Passover. They would have eaten a Passover lamb.
Yes.
The Passover lamb was required not only for you to sacrifice it, so going back to the actual original Passover, but you had to consume it as
All of it.
well. All of it. That's
Yes.
right. And the fulfillment of that, let's call it a liturgy almost in a sense, is in the Eucharist, right? And I would say that there is an almost natural fallen reluctance to participate in the sacrifice of the Mass because of not just the worship of God, but the participation in the participation in the sacrifice of Jesus. It's one thing to acknowledge he died on a cross for my sins and it is finished, and a lot of these sort of Christian
Yes.
platitudes that we will sort of throw at our adoration of the cross, but we don't participate in Calvary unless we participate in the sacrifice of the Mass. And that's in the same way that all the apostles, except for our Blessed Mother, Saint John, and Saint Mary, they all fled. They didn't want to see that gruesome sight. They didn't want to have any participation in what that looked like. But but for the sake of our redemption, we not only have to observe it, we have to then consume that sacrifice, which is as intimate an admission of the fact of our own mortality as I think you can possibly confront in this life. And it seems to me that insisting on a vegetarian lifestyle is almost a refusal to admit to that mortality, that because of our fallen nature, because of the fact that we are dying, other death has to pay for our lives. And not only the death of sentient beings, but of God himself. And I think there are a lot of people for whom that is such a hard pill to swallow, no pun intended, that they just don't want to participate in it, just
Yes.
on the face of it.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of humiliation in it that is good for us almost, I think.
I totally agree. And I think it's like it reminds me of that altarpiece, the Ghent altarpiece. That's so
Yeah,
beautiful with the
yeah,
central figure of the lamb who's
yeah.
standing up and bleeding out.
And just bleeding out. Yeah,
Yeah, and of course that symbolism only makes sense in a meat-eating culture, but a blood-eating culture, in fact. And yeah, I mean, you can read. I think it's one of the councils, Council of Florence in the 15th century,
yeah.
that made it, official, explicit. That yes, you can eat blood. You can consume these
Mm,
things, uh,
mm,
particularly blood in that case. But I think you're right that there is a. I think it even goes back further. The eating of meat, and even all of our agriculture is characterized by a toil, the sweat of our
mm,
brow, right?
mm,
And
mm-hmm.
it's actually, I think the right way to understand it is not just nourishment, which is a power that we share with all living things,
Mm,
but it is, in a way, it is penance.
mm.
And you think about the first
Yeah,
law that was broken, the first sin was a violation of a law of abstinence. And so we
right.
sinned against abstinence by eating
when we
fruit. And
should and what we
so
shouldn't.
a
Yeah.
fitting, yes. And so a fitting penance for that would be, okay, by the sweat of your brow, you will toil for all of your food now.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
that is going to be the medium of your sin,
Mm.
it is going to be toil and sweat of your brow, and the ground is going to yield you thorn and thistle. It's going to be
Yeah, the ground is
difficult.
cursed. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
ground is cursed. Yeah. So there's a sense in which there is a justice, I think, involved in the toiling for our food.
Yeah.
And we extricate ourselves from that toil to our own detriment because there is penance is just and it is
Yes.
good,
Yeah.
you know, and it's
Yeah.
I mean, I guess in the best way, it can be an act of charity if we participate in it. It is
Mm.
recompense to the God whom we have offended. This
Mm-hmm.
toil, it is right and just.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
there's a
that's so
lot,
good.
there's a lot of that there too with the sacrificial system and
Wow.
sacrificing animals as penance.
Yeah.
Um,
It's very hard to understand the sacrifice of Christ without the tradition of the sacrifice of animals, of which it fulfills, right?
yeah,
Again, this notion that death pays for your life.
yeah,
Um, I think some people think, well, I don't need that. I don't need death to pay for my life. And that's a refusal to admit your own condition, I think. There's an arrogance in
yes,
that. There's a pride in that.
yeah. I agree, and that's why it's so funny to me when we used to have a cafe in the little town where I used to live. It was very, very progressive, very liberal, and it had
Mm.
it met all of the dogmas perfectly. It was vegan, it
Mm.
was locally sourced, it was organic, it was all of the buzzwords. It had all of them, and the
Yeah.
name of this cafe was Pure. And
Mm.
I'm like, come on, guys. This
Yeah.
is the Pharisaism is not just the province of, religious people.
Right. No. No.
This is a Puritan
Right.
progressivism here.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very well. That's that's interesting. Okay. I want to wrap this up to some degree, but in a time of instability, of rising costs, and everything that is afflicting people today who used to take so much for granted, um, do you have any sort of closing remarks or advice you would give to most people that are sort of saying, wow, the fragility that he was describing, I couldn't have been convinced of that 5 years ago, but now I'm starting to wonder. So what advice would you give to people
Yeah.
who are willing to listen to what you have to say about that?
I think that it's going to sound, I don't know, condescending, but learn how to fast. And I mean that
Mm,
actually, like technically, uh,
okay.
even before the fragility of the system became so evident to us in the past 2 years, in particular, there is when you part of raising food at home and using stretching out the utility and the thrift of that is actually being able to limit yourself. And
Mm,
it's a different way than we're used to eating. Usually we start with what we want to eat and then we go acquire what we want and then we eat it.
yeah.
But if you're raising food at home, you start with what you've got, with what you've raised. And
Mm,
then you get creative in consuming that and being thrifty about it, but also making sure that you are extravagant about it during feasts. And
mm.
that is
Oh man.
but you do start with a limitation that I think it's only counterintuitive to modern people who that's just how we acquire food now. We purchase what we want, we conceive
Mm,
what we want, we go get it, and then we eat it. It's just a
mm.
different paradigm. And
Yeah.
so, like in my family, we go when we slaughter a pig, we eat pork every day for many months,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
in various forms. So you get really creative. But as far as the sheer diversity of ingredients, it's extraordinarily limited.
Mm.
Um, but you find it's just like I always use this metaphor. It's just like writing a sonnet. The limitations are actually the fruit
Freeing.
of
Yeah.
they are the fun part. That's what creates something that
Yeah.
is truly unique and beyond the horizons of your mere likes and dislikes, which are so
Right.
little and right here.
Yes. Very
Um,
narrow.
yeah, and that's you learn how to cure meat, you learn how to preserve it, you learn how to eat it at different stages of ripening. Bacon should be hanging in your kitchen,
Mm,
and your prosciutto. It's
mm,
it's cured not just for flavoring, but for preservation.
mm.
So it's
Yeah.
simultaneously thrifty and extravagant.
Yep.
So
Yep. Hmm.
just that little mind change of not regarding food as merely an object of my appetite,
Hmm.
but limiting yourself to what is available, which takes an act of will because you can just go to the store.
Yes.
So you actually have to self-impose this limitation these days,
Yep. Yep.
to just, no, we're not going to buy meat. We just slaughtered a pig for the next whatever, 4 months. We're not going to buy meat. We're
Mm.
gonna eat this animal,
Yeah.
and we're going to eat every part. We're going to endeavor to. We're going to eat the head. We're going to make head cheese. You know,
Hmm.
it's all easier, and it is all. I mean, the funny thing about my classes is they're almost anticlimactic. I feel like I'm showing people how to create these traditional recipes that again are the prowess of the home cook.
Hmm.
So they're simple and they work. They are designed for family nourishment.
Hmm.
And they also taste the best without exception. They are by far the most flavorsome.
Hmm.
Um, so I would say that would be the first step. Start to change the way you regard food in that
Hmm.
way. But then also realize that it is, well, I knew nothing. I have zero farming experience, butchery or slaughtering experience before, honestly, before we became Catholic. That was right about the time that I just got a job at a little farm, started working
Okay.
there. There wasn't even on the job training there. It was just, I learned how to cook first
Okay.
because I had a plethora of fine ingredients, and in order to sell them, which was our job, and make a living at the farmers markets, I had to teach people how to cook with them.
Hmm.
And so I think the other part of the battle is learn how to cook.
Hmm.
And because it actually, the thing about butchery and animal processing is that the thing is not about butchery, it's about cookery. You are cutting the animal to fit your pot, your pan, and your oven. And
Hmm.
if you know how to use those three things, then you are better qualified to cut up that animal
Yeah.
than a conventional butcher at a grocery store.
Hmm.
And that's a huge advantage. And that's why I say you got to learn how to cook, which I think goes back to this Thomistic idea of, you were mentioning the different kinds of souls
Yeah.
and the order of being. And we have living things have natural powers of growth, nutrition, and reproduction.
Yeah.
And we share those things with grass. But we do them all differently as beings with intellect and will.
Hmm.
And we even, especially reproduction, and we particularly though, we can't exclude nourishment also.
Yeah.
Like we should be cooking our food well. It
Hmm.
should be delicious. It
Hmm.
it is more ordered for it to be delicious because we have taste buds. When you feed a human with an eternal soul, you cook a certain way.
Hmm.
The culinary arts are a reflection of our immortal soul. They're the fact that we have a soul, I think. And
Hmm.
all the best kitchens in Europe were the Royal Catholic kitchens that gave us so much of our wonderful French culinary traditions.
Yeah.
It's because it is right and proper to cook well, which also happens to be the most pragmatic thing you can do. Because when you cook well, you're going to desire the best ingredients, and the best ingredients are the ones you raise at home.
Yeah.
So that's too many words, but there's so many.
No, that's
Come
well
take a
said.
class with me, and we'll cover a lot of it too. That's what we
Okay,
do.
so how can people do that? How can they follow you? How can they if they're inspired by this, how can they learn more?
Yeah, you can go to our website, farmsteadmeatsmith.com, and we have classes that we offer here and sometimes in other states. I do a fair bit of traveling recently, but we do full harvest here, and they're for complete noobs that have never done any of it.
Hmm.
But at the end of it, you will know how to harvest a pig, for example,
And
from
and
beginning
where
to end.
exactly is here? So you're in Oklahoma, but where?
Just
What's the?
so we're in northeastern Oklahoma. I'm just outside of Tulsa.
Okay.
So it's very easy to fly right in, and the airport's 25 minutes away.
Okay.
Lots of lodging options. But yeah, our classes are undiluted. They're very hands-on, and they're like
Hmm.
2 or 3 days long. And you find that when you see the whole narrative from living animal all the way to meal,
Yeah.
um, it fits in your brain. It's not
Hmm.
as complex as the disintegrated food system would lead one to believe.
Hmm.
It fits in your brain and in your backyard and in your kitchen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I have a small online membership where I put, 50, I've got an archive of over 50 films detailing everything from rabbits to pigs and sheep, the husbandry, the harvesting, the curing, traditional methods of curing, and the cooking. It's all in the Meatsmith membership. It's also on our website.
Great. Well, Brandon Shear, the Meatsmith, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and thoughts with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. All right. Take care. Thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you feel called to support this work, then consider joining the Reinforcements, which is my online community. There are multiple tiers, including free access for those who can't help financially but still want to join. You can join up at www.brianholdsworth.ca. Certain levels will also get a free gift basket from Glory and Shine, who is a family-owned Catholic bath and body products company whose beard balm I'm wearing right now. It's like aromatherapy for your face. Even if you don't join, they make amazing products, so check them out at gloryandshine.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe. You don't have to agree with everything I said to get value out of these kinds of conversations, so be sure to subscribe to be edified or challenged. There's value in both.